tonight it's a real pleasure to have Debbie Meier here. I think for a lot of us, Debbie Meier is sort of our true north. Education is a really difficult profession, and it's a profession in which it's easy to get disoriented. Actually, the head of our publications just stopped me on the way out and said, "I have a great anecdote." And I said, "Oh, yeah, what's that?" And she said, "Well, you know, I had a doctor's appointment this morning, and I had a new intern, and she was just sort of beginning her practice, but she clearly seemed older than most interns now, who, as Irma Bombeck used to say, most of them are younger than my oldest cookie tin is, cookie sheet is. That's sort of what I relate to. But she said she seemed a little older than most of the interns, and so she asked a question, and the intern said, "Well, you know, this isn't the first thing that I have done." And she said, "Oh, what else did you do?" She said, "Well, I was a teacher for a while, but it was just too hard." And I thought that was just a remarkable statement from the medical profession. But I think for all the reasons that you all know so well sitting out there in the audience, education is extremely difficult, and nobody's making it easier, not the politicians, or not the funders, and not the parents, and not anybody that I know of. And as an education school, what we try and do is at least be supportive. And to that end, we try and bring people in who can share their messages. And Debbie's really such a fabulous person to do that. She's an educator's educator, in that whether you're in research or in practice, she seems to understand absolutely what you're all about. Our new dean, Ellen Lageman, has said that, you know, it's incredibly important for theory to inform practice, but by the same token that it's incredibly important for practice to inform theory, and then back again, that there really needs to be a constant dialogue. And I know that Debbie's work in the field has always been that. This is Debbie's second book, and she still neglects to use her maiden name, which she just told me if she used it, it would sell a few more books. I said it probably doesn't matter. I'm sure it sells tons anyway. Her first book was really a wonderful revelation, The Power of Their Ideas, Lessons for America from a Small School in Harlem. This is a wonderful book. In schools, we trust. And in Deb's introduction, she says in here, the message of this book is not just trust us. The title, with its echoes of In God We Trust, is a provocation, not an invocation. Our schools must never be beyond question, argument, or debate. First, our schools don't deserve such trust. And second, I don't think it would be healthy for us to invest such trust in any secular institution, and surely not in any democratic institution. I invoke the religious parallel as a challenge. What kind of trust can and should we have in our schools? What kind of trust should we practice within their walls? I'm delighted to have Deb here, and I'm just really thrilled to sit in the audience and listen to her. If you scroll through the web and look at all her talks, she never gives the same talk. Even if she intends to give the same talk, it's never the same talk. She's one of the most imaginative thinkers, I think, about education, and uses a vocabulary that is never trite or staid, or that you think you're, you know, listening to somebody who's been there, done that for 40 times and just has it down to formula. I don't think education will ever be a formula for Deb, and I think that's why we all love and admire her so much, that in spite of that, she continues to be enormously successful and to share her insights and her troubles and her wisdom with us. So, Deb Meier, come share with us.
Well, thank you. Every time I talk, I have a double feeling. One, that I should give an entirely new talk, because I'm always in the verge of going off in a new direction. And when I do that, which I'm not really quite going to do tonight, it's usually works. It doesn't work the first time you do it, because it's fine to think aloud as you talk. But if you really haven't any idea where you're going to go with something, sometimes you never get there. So I've been on the road for the last 2 weeks talking, which happens after you write a book. And I don't know how. I suspect a substantial number of you out there have written a book in the last few years. And you feel a little the way I do, and that is, how come everybody isn't reading the book? How come even your best friends aren't? And how come some of them said they started it, and they will get around to finishing it? How could they put it down? It's so fascinating. And as I was explaining to Tony, the ending comes as a kind of a surprise. And, you don't tell your friends what happens at the end. Make them read it. And every time someone wants to ask me a question, I want to say to them, read the book. Don't ask me that. Chapter 7 says that. Chapter 10 says the answer to that. So partly I'm here to tell you to go buy the book on your way out. And don't wait to read. It can be read. It's only less than 200 pages at the proper rate for a literate person. So this is a kind of test of your literacy skill. You should have it finished before the night is out. Now, there's an enormous vanity in writing a book, because it's built upon that childish idea we had years ago that if we could only say this right, we could change the world. And lo and behold, it's not true. As reading anyone else's book, because the number of books I've read in the last year in which I think, how come this book didn't change the world? Because it is already so marvelous. So some part of myself feels that we should, all of us, agree to stop writing books and reread the ones that someone as vain as us already wrote and said more or less what we're still trying to say. So, but it keeps going. And as I sometimes remind myself also, we do influence people, but we never know exactly how we've influenced them. And sometimes they read our books and reach the opposite conclusion. Or sometimes they read it and think we said this when we meant exactly that. And it's one of the facts of life, because if a book could convert us, we wouldn't need schools, right? We would just all read my book, so to speak. But then we would be a terrible society, because we would all think exactly the same way and our ideas would go nowhere. We are messy and confusing and complicated people, in which case, of course, in a way, nothing we write or say can and should change the world. I did once give a speech about 2 years ago, and someone came up afterwards and told me that I had actually entirely transformed her life. I would never understand how deeply I had impacted on her. And I was kind of thrilled and pleased. And then she said, I'll never worry about the kind of shoes I wear anymore. So, maybe that was the most important influence I ever had on anyone. Now, of course, after 2 weeks on the road, I'm somewhat bored with what I have to say. And it's interesting. When I wrote the last book, The Power of Their Ideas, I gave a speech here at Dottie, right? Maybe it was Asquith. I'm not trying to remember where. It wasn't in this room, though. And I gave a speech, and actually that speech was the beginning of the book that I've written now. It was kind of a moving beyond that book. And that is one of the dilemmas when you finish a book, is half of you is moving beyond that book. But, in fact, I'm not far enough beyond it. I know also that there are a number of close friends in the room, and that is, I often say, not the most comforting thought. First of all, they've heard me speak before, in which case they are I'm either going to tell the same factual story differently, and they're going to note that I didn't quite say it that way last time, which is the real story, or they might be bored by it, or they might know that I'm fudging a little on reality. But read the book, and it will fill in the parts in between. And besides which, I don't want to give the whole book away, so in some ways I want to talk about what I didn't say in the book. although it pertains to what I said in the book, but a little bit differently. First of all, because I didn't say everything I wanted to say in the book, as my editor kept reminding me, and because it's been a year since I stopped working on it, and the world and my own thoughts haven't stopped. The book itself makes a simple proposition, so I'll tell you that and then I'll move on. The book's proposition is that we're fighting the wrong enemy. And we're fighting it with silly tools to measure success even at the battle we think we're engaged in. And as a result, we're making the real crisis of education ever worse because we haven't named the real one. The crisis relates to trust, and that I'll talk more about later. And every move we've made of late in the area of educational policy has increased the distrust, not the trust upon which good education must rest. The problem isn't, strictly speaking, that our kids aren't sufficiently competent in academics, or even in being literate or mathematical, important as those are. No employers, even assuming that was our major purpose, was supplying employers with good workers, except for employers who are looking for teachers of history or mathematics or English. None of the rest of them complain about students who, actually, almost none complain about students who can't do calculus, or certainly none complain about students who don't know the date of the Civil War, which, of course, as a history major, I think they should. Or none of them complain about students who can't define a pronoun or adverb. What employers, assuming they are our measuring rod, do complain about is actually the same thing I do. Now, I'll tell you a little story. For example, I'm going to California recently with my granddaughter, and she has a lot of homework to get done on the way out. And so we're sitting together, and the homework sheets are very neatly laid there, and she's trying to fill them in and work through the problem. And I start having a nice discussion with her about, you could expand on this. This is really an interesting idea here. This reminds me, and so forth. You should recognize that, parents? And she says indignantly, Grandma, that's not what my teacher asked me to do. She asked me to fill in this sheet. And I thought to myself, she's probably right, that if she did what I wanted to do, and all other 120 kids that her teacher has to read, whose homework the teacher has to read, she would give up teaching hard. That would be impossible. We never stop to ask ourselves, what would a teacher do if she had 120 diligent students? It's like the no-show and problem in airlines. If everybody did show up, what would happen? If everybody was a diligent student, what would the average high school teacher do? What we know is that too many young people leave our schools as people who can't be counted on to be there when they're needed, who don't take initiative. I'm talking in the workplace, not in terms of their friendships. Who only do what they're told to, who don't immerse themselves in getting to the bottom of a problem, who aren't curious and intrigued by the business of the company they're working for. And that's because they have my granddaughter's attitude. This is what I was told to do. They don't want anything more of me. Whether that's true or not, we have spent 12 plus years drilling into young people's minds the idea that life is like homework, that the real world is like the school world, when in fact it isn't. And the reforms we're now touting are no answer to these real complaints, mine or theirs, but only make it worse. And the way we're going about deciding if our reforms are working can't possibly tell us, because they're not designed to give us any of the answers we need. Not about academic achievement, not about calculus, not about simple reading skill, or much less the dates of the Civil War. How well kids answer the question about Civil War, as I have noted, depends on what the multiple choices are. So sometimes we're very pleased they seem to know about the Civil War because we gave them the dates 1450, 1670, 1864. And sometimes we've given them dates that are very close. And in one case they appear to know the date of the Civil War, in one case they don't appear to know the date of the Civil War. It depends how we ask it and what we ask. The intellectual and social and moral judgment that kids develop before they leave school as already able to fully vote and sit on juries is nowhere on the screen when we ask ourselves, do our schools do a good job? We've literally organized the lives of our children to be sure that when it comes to adult tasks, the things we want them to do when they're grown up, they have virtually no experience. They're not only not engaged or invested or responsible, but they haven't lived amidst the company of adults who are engaged in the tasks we want them to engage in when they're grown-ups. Taking responsibility for their own ideas, much less even knowing what an idea is, experiencing the impact of their ideas on their work, on the lives of others. We've organized our schools and we've organized children's lives so that does not take place. But the fact of the matter is, and the proposition of the books is, there is no way to educate young people except in the company of grown-ups we and they trust, who can act like grown-ups in their presence. We learn largely from the company we keep. And in fact, that was the original title of the book I had in mind writing. Its title changed partly because publishers have their own ideas, and it may come as a surprise to you, it was to me, that authors don't choose their titles unless they're very famous. I suspect some authors may choose their titles. But the company they keep, or some variation of that, which was my original thought, got shifted to in Schools We Trust. And I think the second one is catchier. And it probably also speaks as basically to the issue I'm raising, because the company that I'm speaking of is company with people their kids, their families, and society trusts. That's what influences us, the company we keep. My granddaughter, she forgives me for using her so often, but she's the oldest of my grandchildren, just learned to drive recently. And she just got her driver's license. And it might interest you to know, it always amazes me that she was thrilled to get her driver's license. It meant an enormous amount to her. But she did not say to me that I was in the upper quartile. I passed it in the top grade level. I beat out my friends. She was only interested in one thing, was did she pass it? And could she now drive? She learned to drive, I would argue, largely by keeping company with drivers. And those of us who were not, those of you who were not lucky enough to learn to drive that way, probably will always slightly suffer from that fact. But it certainly was much harder to learn. In the end, most young people who live in the company of drivers know that as they are driving in the company of adults they trust, they are already internalizing what it is to drive, just as little babies learn to be bigger babies, learn to be humans, if you will, by the company they keep. They learn to be humans not because we sit there didactically to teach them to be humans, but because they realize we are the human beings they are going to become. And similarly, it is in the company of drivers, basketball players, tennis players, and people who are arguing about interesting ideas, people who are reading books, that we learn to become them. That's the role that play has in early childhood life. It is to try out the roles that we see being played by the company we're keeping. Their families or their teachers. It's in family life, school life, and community life that children learn to become grown-ups. But we are the first society, human or animal, that I have ever heard of, that has organized itself so that the closer kids get to being adults, the less likely they are to be in the company of adults. Say that over yourself over and over again. It can statistically be proven that kids spend less and less time in the company of adults the closer they get to being adults, minute by minute. And the adults whom they are in the company of are largely not adults they know anything about. You may say that kids are in the company of adults for 5.5 hours in school, but that's using the word company very loosely. They are in the physical presence of an adult, but there are not adults around them. The world is organized around their peer packs. They are raised in peer packs, starting very young and lasting an enormously long time. Peer packs that are loosely monitored by overworked adults constrained by the necessary rules and regulations of institutional life. And this goes on from the time they are 3, 4, or 5 years old until they are often well past 20. And if they don't spend that much time in school, we call them dropouts. For the very young, they spend nearly 12 hours in such arrangements. I have an enormously large number of children in my school who arrive at school 7, 8 o'clock in the morning and don't leave either our school or their after-school center until after 6. We have organized our society so that adults not simply work longer, but they work in settings which do not have young people in them. They have separated the two generations. Now, I don't want to glamorize the good old days when young children kept company with their fathers in the coal mines. So there are many ways in which we keep company. But they were learning something about being grown-ups. Some terrible things, but something about being grown-ups, even in those coal mines. Today, our children learn nothing except about what it's like to be a teacher. It's as though we wanted them all to become teachers. But we've created schools in which it's very likely that the model of teaching that we offer them is very attractive to the young. It starts earlier, in other words. It takes up more and more of the day in the year. Our school day lasts longer than it ever was. The year lasts longer than it ever did. And of course, to make matters more difficult, there is one group of adults who is paying very close attention to them. Now, I mentioned this in a speech out, Oregon, someplace I was recently, and someone in the front row nodded his head and he said, yes, with coaches. And I thought it was interesting that came to his mind. And he's probably right, that the relationship kids have with their coach, if they're athletes, is probably closer to being genuine company than the role that most of us are accustomed to between teacher and student. But there is actually a much more powerful group than coaches who are out there paying attention to our kids. They have a lot of money, a lot of resources, and they're extremely interested about our kids, and they spend a lot of research compared to what the education industry does, an enormous amount of research trying to figure out how to influence the young, how to reach them, how to engage them, how to get them excited so they will buy what they want them to buy. They're trying to get the money out of their pocket. And they know a lot about our kids, but they also know a lot about how to change the way our kids think so that our kids will want what they would like to sell. Our kids today have more money than any non-working adults have ever had before. And if they do work and enter the adult working world, they are largely working at enterprises in which they see almost nothing but other people their same age. Go into the Gap. All the young salespeople are about the same age. Go into McDonald's. They may be young people working there, but they're all about the same age, even supervised by people who are not much older than them. The only things left to influence many kids, their families are still there as devoted as ever. And I have no evidence that they're not as devoted as ever, but they have enormously less time than they did to keep company with their kids, either healthy company, any kind of company. I don't know what the numbers are, but in the last 20, 30 years, I do know that it's something like 3 weeks more. If you put the working hours together, adults are working approximately 3 weeks longer during the school year. This is between overtime and shortened vacations. Some of you are old enough to remember in the 60s that there was an awful lot of talk about the coming age of leisure. In fact, one of the functions of education in the 60s was to prepare us for the time when modern technology would replace the time-consuming work and would leave us with a great deal more leisure time to spend with our families, our children, learning to ski, to write books, to paint. But in fact, the modern technology not only hasn't done that, but it follows us home, right? So that even when we finally get home and relax, the phone rings and it's right over here. Or as we're driving to and from work, which used to be a time that you couldn't do anything else, you can now answer the phone too. So a larger and larger portion, not just of poor people's time, there also used to be the image of the leisured classes, that the people who were well off, that you could divide society by how much work they put in. The poorer they were, the harder they worked, and the richer they were, the more leisure time. And I used to say, just occurred to me recently, that the notion of leisure was normally associated with wealth, power, and for what I thought was a natural reason, and that is that the governing classes needed some time to think so they could plan, manipulate, whatever you want to call it, so they could plan for the future. Once in a while, I think that at least one nice thing about the present circumstances is that the rich, for all their other advantages, are working at least as hard these days as the poor. And therefore, maybe they won't have enough time to think about how to get their self-interest even more served. But so far, I haven't seen a lot of evidence for that. Well, what are we offering the kids as an alternative to the influence of the media, the shopping mall, where I have become accustomed to going with my grandchildren? What's the other world we've offered them? We've offered with real resources. We've offered them schools. Now, I'm not attacking us, but even the best schools that I know, like my own, right, Kathy. But truthfully, I ask you, are we as attractive as the entertainment world? Are we really a good alternative? Do many kids say, thank goodness I'm going to school, which is interesting, compelling, and engaging, and I don't have to sit home and watch television, which is so boring? It sounds almost silly to ask that question, but it's a dreadful indictment. If they want to come to school, they come to school, right, to see their friends, not to see us grown-ups, not because what we're doing in school is so engaging that that's the place they want to be. But 20 years of working with secondary school students has convinced me of one thing, that the desire for authentic relationships with adults still exists. It hasn't died out. The deprivation has not killed off young people's interest in grown-ups. And in fact, I think they still crave it, although they're not much influenced with it. Part of my evidence is simple ones, it's all those sometimes the worst kids in the school who arrive at our front door at 6:30 in the morning and can't be chased away in the evening till 6:30 or 7, in which case, and who don't, you can say, well, they're really looking for their friends, but they keep bumping into us. They keep coming into the school even when they're not allowed to. They come in and let you know they're still there. They want the interactions they have with us. And as I used to say about Central Park East Secondary School's amazing success with young people, our curriculum was great, our pedagogy was marvelous, but the truth of the matter is what made the difference was the unbelievably interwoven relationships that virtually all the kids had with significant adults whom they knew through the school. And in fact, when Paul Schwartz and I once took a list to see which kids had we failed with, we were trying to think about what was significant about the kids we had not succeeded with. And the one thing that was absolutely clear about that group, what differentiated them, was that we couldn't think even of one grown-up in that school who had built a very strong relationship. Now, that's a combination of reasons involved in that. In part, these were kids who knew how to resist, who didn't want, who were afraid of, didn't want, were fearful of, had dilemmas about making a relationship. And we had not found a way to break through. We had not found that adult who might have done it, that situation, that setting, that might have allowed this kid to shift their stance towards joining the adult world. But nevertheless, we hadn't. And that lack, that absence of bonds, had an almost one-to-one correlation with the kids who did not succeed at our school. They're not miraculously cured of all the problems in the world or turned into instant intellectuals by our company. And our company, even ours at Mission Hill, won't always be all that I wish it were. But it's the one place that public policy can start. We can set up schools where we can possibly build trustworthy relationships with young people and adults other than their families, with a community of adults that includes their family, where we can bring to reality for them what it means to be a member of a community that's larger than yourself. And ideally, we can do it in the company of adults who are interesting and who have important contributions, intellectually and social contributions to make to young people. But trust is the essential starting point. Trust can't be built in communities where people don't know each other. It can't be built in communities where people can't act upon their knowledge of each other. Kids need not merely adult company, but the company of adults they might just imagine they would like to become, and better yet, see as people they could become. It has to seem believable and attractive to be grown-ups like them. I often tell stories about the various people I wanted or didn't want to be as growing up. And both qualities had to be there. My brother learned, as I've often told people, that how to play baseball, not only by playing it, but by watching it. We spent a lot of time at Yankee games. It was the only winners I was ever for. And I was as enthusiastic as my brother as a Yankee fan. But my brother watched the game as a batter, as a hitter. He slid into second base. He was up there swinging that bat, and I was busy keeping data, the statistics on those little score sheets, and thinking about how I might meet one of those attractive baseball players, and maybe he would notice me and marry me. Now, today, women maybe have more choices, and some of them may also think about becoming baseball players, not just marrying them. But the essential argument I'm making is that kids learn to do these things also by observing people they want to become and could imagine becoming. Even if all of our teachers were truly well educated, we have to remember also, however, that they wouldn't all want to be like our teachers. The school needs to provide a setting in which kids not only are exposed to the marvelous ideas that we as teachers might demonstrate in reality in their presence, but also to many other kinds of adult lives. And I have more and more been intrigued by the work of a colleague of mine named Dennis Lutke, the Met schools in Providence, which are spreading all around the country now. They're going to open another 8 in the country the size of the United States. That's a drop in the bucket, but it's still a fascinating drop in the bucket, in which kids spend, starting when they enter high school, half of their school life in the company of adults who are not school teachers, but who take responsibility for sharing what fascinates them with a young person. But as it is, kids cannot possibly learn to play the game of math or the game of science or the game of music unless they're in the company of people who play it. I use the metaphor of game now because if you try to imagine teaching someone how to play baseball who has never seen it, I mean, try explaining the game of baseball to someone who's never seen it, but try to imagine teaching someone who's never seen it, who can't act it out, who can't be part of it. And you know how ludicrous it is for us to imagine that we can teach mathematics or history or any of the things we're doing in school to young people who haven't the slightest idea why this is anything more than a requirement to pass the next ritual. You know, someone asked me the other day about how come we don't teach a second language in our school, and I gave my usual pat answer about I don't know how to do it well. I've never seen second languages taught in our schools in ways in which most children, I will leave aside an exception here or there, in which every child, most children, 50% of children, 30% of children learn to be fluent in a second language. I haven't seen it in the best and fanciest schools, and I haven't seen it in any of the other schools in America, with rare exceptions. Even though students take 4 years of Spanish the way I did in high school, they don't learn to speak Spanish. But then I realized that actually the same thing is true about history and math. That was an embarrassing moment for me. It's just that in language, we know that what it means to be competent is to be fluent in the language of it. But we don't assume after 4 years of math that kids have any sense of fluency and pleasure in math. That isn't what we taught it for. We taught it for in a way to make sure they passed the exams and could claim they had 4 years of math and ended up with calculus. Ditto, history, and so forth. If we judged history and literature the way we do foreign languages, we might realize we're equally inept, that we need an immersion approach to learn a new language, and we need an immersion approach to learn mathematics. It's partly so obvious and yet partly so hard to believe. I'm told, well, how could we possibly get kids excited about these ideas? Once they get the facts, maybe then they'll get excited. Now, I'm assuming that's what people believe, because surely they don't think the way we're covering history in the state of Massachusetts would ever get a kid excited about ideas. Kids can imagine getting excited and arguing about whether something's a ball or a strike. But how often, I shouldn't say have you ever, but how often and in what circumstances have you heard kids arguing about different historical interpretations, mathematical theorems, scientific truths? If you don't know your history, though, I'm told you're destined to repeat its mistakes. But do any of us really believe it? I mean, I know my own personal history, and I repeat my mistakes over and over again. And some of the countries in the world, and I could name you a few, who are most thoroughly indoctrinated in their history, are the ones who seem to me most likely to repeat it again and again and again. And in fact, some people used to argue that it was America's lack of respect for its own history in a certain way that made us learn how to change the future. You could do a good argument. I could imagine a good debate in which one side says, the less you know of history, the more likely you are to learn from it, and the other says the reverse. But we don't argue that with kids. We announce to them that knowing history is necessary, whether you like it or not, or fascinated or not, and whether we teach it well or not. You need to know it. They really know why. You need to know it in order to get 3 credits, in order to pass this thing, so you get this certificate. But we say to them, you need to know it so that you can avoid making future mistakes. You need to know about Munich so you can make sure that we don't repeat Munich. Well, think of how much you would have to know about Munich. You'd have to spend a few years studying that period of history to assume you could even imagine saying that understanding Munich would help you decide what we should do in Iraq. That's what we mean about repeating history. And after all, there are historians who surely know, who studied the period of Munich deeply and well, who come to different conclusions about what we should do with Iraq. That's not, I would argue, a sufficient answer to young people. Here we have these healthy young people, full of vim, vigor, enthusiasm, engagement, desire, passion. And we send them to schools in which they have neither interesting adults to surround them or interesting stuff to get their teeth into. The advertising industry knows something better about how to attract them than we do. You know, I was even thinking on the simple job thing. I mean, sometimes it just is infuriating. On the simple job fact that I once saw a study that was done about New York City that proved that there were more actual jobs in New York City with people with advanced art skills than there were jobs in New York City for people with advanced mathematical skills. Nevertheless, New York City entirely gutted its entire art field departments. New York City, which once had one of the greatest public school music programs, has virtually none left, and its visual arts aren't much better. Something drives us to bedevil the young, even as we say, leave no child behind. We need teachers, we need schools, and we need communities who first of all ask, what's this for? Why are we doing this? Why does it matter? What's important about it? And then comes to their own conclusions in a way that allows them to look into the face of the children they teach and say, the reason we're learning this is because I believe in it. I believe that this is the right thing. I'm not doing it because they told me to. I'm not doing it because they told me to. I'm doing it. And therefore, I can convince you. Not overnight, but I got a shot at convincing you that one, it's interesting. Two, it's exciting, interesting, exciting. And three, that it will be important to you because I know it's important. That's the kind of grown-ups kids need to be involved with. That's what the coach of the front row in Seattle was right about. He gets the kids who are convinced. Now, I don't remind him that he doesn't do as well in gym classes. When people give me the sports analogies, they are always, if you notice, only telling me about the sports played by the team of the best players. You know, like they're always talking in a sense about our advanced placement classes where the teachers do pretty well too. They're not talking about how kids feel about phys ed classes in school. Yeah, when kids are convinced something is important and engaging and that they can join in something which seems meaningful to them, drill and practice no longer is a problem. Drill and whatever we used to call it, drill and kill and drill is no longer a problem. Now, I'm just throwing out that picture again to you because it's been obsessing me for the last 20 years. That's the schools we need. And that, in fact, we have some of them in this country. We have some halfway there. We have a few all the way there, and a few struggling to get there. But we have a public policy milieu which sets every obstacle in the way of the schools that are attempting to be that for young people. Can we change that milieu? Well, only, I would argue, if we also make an alliance with the other group of people outside of the field of education who have an equal passion for our children, and in fact a far greater passion, and I mean their families, their parents. The war between schools and families must end if we are to change the lives of our kids. And it's a very old war, and it's a war with an interesting history, and I don't know who has written a good book about it. Seymour Saracen captures it in some of his work, but it's a war that's been going on for a long time. And it's not surprising, even in our lovely school, to have overheard one of our staff members say to another one, jokingly, on the way down the steps, "Some days I think I would like to teach in an orphanage." I would say almost every day I have one encounter with a family which makes me think about orphanages and their merits. But starting with my own experiences in Chicago, Philadelphia, and then New York City, and now Boston, the struggle and the tension between families and schools stands out everywhere. And it's not surprising to me that in some ways it's a struggle between two largely female groups. You know, the teaching force of America is largely women, and the parents whom we're largely struggling with as teachers are largely women. And we're the two most vulnerable groups in the world, two groups of women who are very ready to point the finger at ourselves and say we must have failed, and for whom it is excruciating then when the other one says, yes, you have. The two groups who need the most to come together and say, listen, we're struggling over this together, and neither one of us knows exactly for sure what the answer is, are the two groups who are most likely to be saying in America today that it's not their fault, it's the other one's fault. And they are the two groups who are largely being blamed for the educational crisis in America. Scratch a teacher, as the polls will tell you, and most of them say, what's wrong with our schools is parents don't care enough. They don't care the way they used to. They're not there for their children. They don't get their kids to do homework. They don't read every night for an hour. I tell parents in our school they're supposed to read every night for 30 minutes to an hour, right? I never did it when I was a parent. I don't mean I didn't do it sometimes, but night after night after night, no. I would often say, I'm a little tired tonight. I'll be good tomorrow night. But nevertheless, we as school people, even those of us who are parents, take off that hat in school and judge our parents as lacking, as missing something, and vice versa. Even parents who are teachers start discussing why we should have 2 hours a night at homework. And I say, but if we did 2 hours a night of homework, and we spent 20 minutes, and we spent only 5 minutes looking at the homework the next day, 5 times 20, we would need, and not to mention getting back to the kid about it, we would need an extra 2 or 3 hours just to deal with homework every night, ourselves, as teachers. I know you don't do that, I say to some teachers in their parent role. But they believe they should. They too believe they should. Only folks who don't know kids are today making policy about kids because we, parents and teachers, are not in a position to make policy. Only people who have forgotten their role with relationship to kids could do. You know that Chicago could do some of the crazy things we're doing. You know in Chicago now, there is no longer recess. The whole city of Chicago, keep in mind how many kids there are. There is no recess in Chicago anymore. And lunchtime has been reduced to 20 minutes. I was staggered when I heard it. It's now commonplace. It happened in Atlanta a few years earlier. What is our picture of children that we could eliminate? Not to mention what life is like inside those schools in Chicago. Because we've also eliminated blocks, we've eliminated art, we've eliminated dance and music for 5-year-olds because teachers know they're supposed to be learning to read before they get to first grade now. And if not learning to read, at least learning to do well on the reading tests. That's the new Chicago plan. And then we complain, by the way, that there's a growing gap between boys and girls in academia. Of course there's a growing gap. I mean, it wasn't invented yesterday. It doesn't take some of this modern cognitive science, scientific research, which is the new name for the Bush administration's agenda, to know that boys develop later in the areas that relate to reading. I mean, that's been true for a long time. So if we make reading success the measure of schooling, and we take out of our classrooms all the things boys, in fact, are good at when they're in pre-kindergarten and kindergarten and first grade, of course, the gap between literacy between boys and girls will grow greater. Even mathematics, and I say this because it's a little heresy right now, we have turned even mathematics into a literacy activity. So the one area that boys, when they were young, were just as good as girls in, adding 2 plus 2 is 4. Now they have to write it down, explain it. First of all, they have to read a little problem about 2 apples and 2 oranges, how many fruits. So they have to read it, and then they have to explain on paper how they solved that problem. And if not, we say, well, they're not very good in math. So we have made them stupid in reading and math. And that's all that's left of their school day. Most kindergartens today are nothing but literacy and math programs, and we brag about it around the country, that we have cut back on all the inessentials. Is the idea that we could create schools differently. It's not far-fetched. We have lots of examples, and yet I am told over and over again that it's utopian. I really am. People say, well, Debbie, we can do that in schools where you're the principal because you're so clever. And you had a degree from the University of Chicago. But we couldn't do that in most schools because we can't trust most teachers. the basis of our notion of distrust. And imagine, if we can't trust most teachers, can we trust most parents? Can we trust most citizens? Why should they vote? Can we trust them to vote? Certainly not. There's plenty of good evidence I could give you for why we shouldn't trust our voters. Look what they do with the vote. It's not that trusting teachers or trusting parents or trusting our fellow citizens means they're going to do it our way. They're not going to. If I trusted teachers, that doesn't mean the teachers of that school over there are going to do the same thing we did at Mission Hill. In fact, they may do very stupid things. They may also decide to get rid of recess. That group of parents and teachers may get together and say, our kids are having too much time having fun in school, let's let them suffer. They might. Just as they might elect a Republican Congress this year. But that doesn't make the dream of democracy utopian. As Winston Churchill said it well, democracy is an extraordinarily flawed idea until you consider the alternatives. That's true in our schools. Creating schools in which parents and teachers join together around the struggle of trust. And I say the struggle because it isn't that they join together already trusting. They join together to figure out how better to trust each other, to raise these kids each in their own domain. That struggle is like the struggle over democracy. It's got tons of faults. It's an extraordinarily flawed idea. It'll produce a lot of half-assed schools. The trouble is, I've seen the alternative, and it's worse. And it cannot produce educated people. Or at least it cannot produce educated people by the definition I think you and I share of what it means to be educated. You can't teacher-proof, kid-proof, or family-proof raising kids. You can't give a formula to parents. I once tried that with babysitters when my kids were little. Maybe I'm not the first person who tried that. I tried to give them an exact formula of what they should do when I left the house. But of course, even as I started writing them down, I realized that they would have to read a volume before, and they aren't likely to read the whole volume because if he does this, you might do this, but if he does this, you might do that, and if the phone rings in the middle of it, what should you do then? There is no way for us to leave a child, even with a babysitter, for an hour without trusting that babysitter. And if we can't trust that babysitter, not because the babysitter deserves trust, but if we can't trust the babysitter, we shouldn't go out. If I can't trust the driver in the car I'm driving, I should get out. There isn't another way to drive in a car but trusting the driver. It won't be better if you stand in the back seat, you keep telling them what to do, right? As we all know, that's how the crash occurs. It might also occur if you trust them. That's the dilemma. If we keep company with people we trust, there's no guarantee. I'm always being told things like, can you guarantee that if we do it your way, all the kids will graduate? Can you guarantee that if we follow your path and your suggestion, that all the kids will grow up strong and beautiful? I couldn't guarantee it with 3 children of my own. I can't guarantee it with 300 children in a school. There are no guarantees in institutions that are human. And people can pretend that there are guarantees by trying to treat the people as though they were robots. But in fact, human beings cannot be robotized. That is the utopian idea. That's the utopian reform. That if we treated everyone as though they were all identical and measured them in ways that are identical, then we can get identical results. Of course, I just want to remind us also, we're not going to get any of these guarantees. We're not even going to get 60% of what we want if we don't do something about the obscene resources gap between the rich and the poor. And I hope you all read what's his name, Paul Krugman's piece in the New York Times a week ago Sunday. We won't get anywhere if we don't do something about the overrushed and overharried lives that our families and children and teachers live. These will do more to close the achievement gap, not to mention raise standards, than even the stuff I'm talking about will. But on a more mundane level, translating these lofty sentiments into practical policy is eminently doable. I don't know how long it will take. One of the advantages of being old is also one of the disadvantages of being old. You've seen it all before. I think it's worse this time around, but I did live through a period of 15 years in New York City in which the only purpose of education was test results, and in which we were regularly called in by principals and superintendents and told what test scores we should get. And it failed, and we went for a short period in a different direction. This too will fail, but the failure of this reform can lead to better paths for children, or can lead to increased discouragement about the capacity of children to learn. So we need to use even this period to build, to open every crack we can, to turn every possibility a little wider, to do a little more educating of our fellow citizens, and translating lofty ideas into some doable, visible good work. You could read Chapter 9 for some eminently practical ideas on this score. And you can read the first 4 chapters to find out more about why trust is so difficult to build in a school. But how to go from here to from where we are now to a plethora of interesting schools that bring adults and children back together again? That's the work of all of you in our field for our lifetime. Thank you very much. There's someone here with a mic. Dottie has a mic there. Thank you, Dottie. And you're supposed to ask questions or make mini speeches. I don't mind either one. Ideally, sometimes ones that disagree with me or raise some significant problem with something that you think I said, which maybe I didn't say. Yes?
Microphone.
Well, we asked you to use the mic.
Okay. Hi, my name's Jason Freeman. I'm a student at the Kennedy School, and I'm struck by what you're saying about moving towards, almost entirely literacy in math. And I've been reading Bob Moses's book, and he talks about how parents tend to look at math and go, "Oh, that's so hard because it was hard for me. It's okay if it's hard for you." And I wonder if, as Americans, I don't know if it's a society or if it's parents or if it's teachers or if it's all of us, that seem to focus on doing the hard things that we like to call hard, and that's why art and music, etc., get cut, because that's just bang on a drum, that's so easy. And if it's something about our society, what it is that we need to change that makes it okay to do something fun can still be challenging.
You're certainly right that we define standards on the basis of how hard it is to do. That rigorous, all these words. I sometimes look up the definition in the dictionary, rigorous, and imagine a school system built on that definition. It is, you certainly have a point, but I'm trying to think, is that largely what we want our children to do? Is this a society that actually hates its young? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. There's certainly merit to it. Now, there actually are very few Americans who found painting pictures easy to do, who are good artists or are good musicians. So I'm not sure it's only a question of hard and easy, but I think that's an aspect of it. You know, what you raise, though, when you say, is that an American habit? Or is it a general feeling that the young should not have it too easy? Partly because they have to get used to being what it would be like when they grow up. Or I wish my parents had pushed me harder. My daughter tells me occasionally that I should have made her stick to taking piano lessons longer than I did, because now she thinks she would like to play the piano better, and it was my fault that I finally gave up driving her. So I think there's a combination of these nostalgias involved in it. But one of the interesting things is that that the notion that one of the things about America that's special, and I don't know of the price we're going to pay for this, is that in fact we were, because of our non-aristocratic histories, we had in fact an extraordinarily anti-intellectual tradition. And even though I resent that, there was a strength in that I think we may well pay a price for. We now keep the kids who didn't get excited by intellectual life in school far longer. We judge them by only one standard. And the qualities that other people used to notice about American kids and American adults that distinguished us, inventiveness, their practical good sense, their respect for the facts. You know, I remember some academics were once visiting our school, and one of them said to the other, well, you know, in theory this doesn't work. What we've just seen, in theory, doesn't work. And I thought, that's a joke in our society. I'm not sure it's a joke in all societies. So we are losing. You know, I'm not a fan of vocational education, but as Ted Sizer reminds us in the book on Horace's Compromise, some of the most powerful intellectual experiences, intellectual meaning not in the sense of only meaning academic, but intellectual experiences, some of the strongest bonds between adults and young people take place in vocational schools. And that the loss of those relationships that sustain so many kids, as well as the capacity to do worthwhile work outside of school. It's not an accident that the phrase, it's academic, means it's of no relevance, right? Someone says to you, oh, well, it's academic. They don't mean, oh, it's deep, interesting, and important, in case you didn't know. And if they say to you and you hand them something to read, oh, this is a really interesting paper. It's very academic, though. They're not complimenting your writing style. So it is amusing that we spend 14 years judging kids on skills that in normal parlance are considered irrelevant and boring. And there may be a price in long-range intelligence and intellectual competence that we pay for that. That's a long answer to a totally different question. Yes?
Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm fascinated by the issue of, or the piece you bring up about trust. A friend of mine gave me chapter 4, so I'm kind of rooted there right now mentally on the teachers trusting teachers. And I work in a building that has many of the ideals that you articulated just this evening coming true. We have good relationships between adults and young people, and many of the other pieces. But what I see happening is that we even have critical friends groups where people bring dilemmas and use protocols and get things out on the table that are otherwise quite awkward. But we're right at the precipice because people rescue each other. I had a teacher bring forward an amazing dilemma about as herself as a special educator and being perceived as not involved because she's not always there and not planning with the other regular ed teacher. And that's very true of where she was and is. And we got right to the edge of acknowledging that. And then there was this rescuing that went on. Well, you know, maybe that's people's perceptions, someone said. And, well, but you work so hard. And so we're so close. You know, we're on the verge of that. I'm just wondering what additional thoughts you have to sort of get inspire us the rest of the way there, I think.
Well, I mean, the same thing is true with kids, right? I mean, there's that moment when you want to tell the kid the truth. You're on the verge of telling him this paper is very boring. But you also know that that may not be the thing that he needs to hear to get him to make it interesting. So it's hard to know, but because in many ways, it's the best part of ourselves as well as the worst part of ourselves that helps us rescue kids, that makes us extraordinarily reluctant to play God, that makes us nervous about wounding another person. And unless you come from a certain kind of New York Jewish argumentative family, you're even more likely to rescue a friend. But the part of it is a reconceptualization of the nature of our community. And it's a shifting of our focus that this is a membership community of caring people, but it is not this is not a family. And you know, one of the things we often say in a good school is we're like a family. But there's a way in which we're like, and there's a way in which we shouldn't be like a family. And I think what you're describing is that whole tension. You know, our colleagues at school are they our best friends? And if we have no life outside of school, it's hard not to begin to see them as your best friends because you haven't any place left for any other friends. And it's one of the risks of a school that becomes too time-consuming, that we invest in it emotional attachments that maybe are not appropriate to the school place. You know, it's not an accident that the person who's least likely to criticize my mothering is my best friend. As I used to say, I would certainly criticize my dog. You know, we don't expect it from someone close to us. And there is a tension between a small school, because I think you need, for a certain set of reasons, you need a school small enough so people can really see each other's work and can tackle it. And so the time spent tackling the school issue is not taken away from teaching, but is part of the same setting. On the other hand, a small school can become so intimate and so supportive of each other and so much there for each other that it loses track of what its central task is. So, yeah, you're raising the right question.
Oh, hi. I'm Fred Fantini. I'm an elected member to the Cambridge School Committee, and actually tomorrow I did buy your book, by the way.
And those who are leaving, just leave that way.
Now, tomorrow we have a meeting. I have a 6-inch notebook of every test that we've given in the Cambridge schools for MCAST and Sanford 9 and our own assessments, and it's something that we're going to be talking about. And actually the news is probably bad news, so that question of trust probably gets a lot worse than better. And so I don't know how we break that cycle, and I'm wondering what kind of discussion, if we had the schools that you talk about, what kind of assessment or what kind of conversation should we be having to build back that trust?
You know, I'm inclined to think, by the way, that we have developed an accountability system in this country, the latest test-based system, which not only, as I explained in chapters 8 and 9, can't do the job. They're not designed to do what we claim they are, but is absolutely designed to do one thing, and that is to create the distrust its claims to solve. It couldn't be a better tool for destroying trust in public education. In a sense, one of the nice things about the market system is that people can say, well, it's your own fault. You chose it. You bought it. You're a sucker. There's no one, and that distrust is built into the market system, right? You're a fool to trust the guy who's trying to sell you something. So that's designed around a climate of minimal trust. And so I don't know. I don't know. I do know that what you're going to discuss tomorrow is absolutely critical. Now, the question of what you can replace it with, I don't think it's hard to think of a variety of things you replace it with. For those communities who think those instruments measure what they want, they should continue them. I would try to persuade them not to, but those school boards should vote for them. In New York State, a majority of the school board associations of New York State have voted. That doesn't mean they have the power to maybe bring this to an effect. They have voted against the use of high-stakes tests to make decisions about kids. I think that will have a long-range impact. I think it's got to be heard by the legislators from those communities in New York State. And I think more and more of that's happening in Massachusetts. The tests can't do that. The tests can do everything to undermine it. But the important part, and one reason I think you should read those chapters carefully, is that they can't even do the simple thing we thought, tell us whether a kid can read. There's a correlation between kids who do well on the test and kids who read well. And I can't possibly explain to you right now quickly, but maybe I will convince you if you read those chapters that it doesn't even do what the Back to Basics folks are hoping it would do. At the very least, tell us whether kids can read and do math. And it can't do it not only because we're human and we answer questions wrong for different reasons than the test maker has in mind, but because, in fact, what the test maker has in mind is not to find out whether we can read, but how to rank order us in such a way that he has a curve. And as long as he rank orders us in such a way to have a curve, we can play around about where to put the benchmarks. But the curve we will keep having. Yes. Yes.
Been a teacher for 25 prior, and it's a terrible feeling to know that there's such an emphasis put on the testing that I would be sitting at a school committee meeting in the anticipation of what somebody is going to judge. The building that I'm in has 750 children, K to 6. I've been there for 4 years, and during that time I've seen an amazing growth in terms of people working together, the children getting off of the bus, saying good morning, making eye contact, working with myself as an administrator, my co-administrator in the building as the assistant principal, and those things are not marked on the test, but they're things that I would hope would be recognized by my school committee, by my boss, by my peers, and when people wonder about administrators that are leaving quickly, I can say in part, I love my job. I really love my job. I hate the fact that I sit as of an evening wondering if someone's going to judge my accomplishments and my staff's based on whether or not the children have gained a point, 2 points, was 2 points enough? You know, and it's really a shame that we're not judging the children for what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, because those growths are not necessarily marked by that one piece of our performance.
In fact, of course, as Richard Elmore reminds us in a recent article in the Harvard Review, those points up and points down are really statistical flukes. Most of the changes of test scores, after a few years, balance out. And they are not likely to give evidence, even of what we pretend they give evidence of. But you asked a question, just occurred to me. Your question was, what can we replace them with? And the FAIR test has put together, I think, a very eminently responsible proposal for what we could replace them with, which might, at the least, include a literacy and math test more like my granddaughter's driver's test, which some kids could say, well, I passed it, and which we did not mark on a curve, just a pass-fail test. But in all other subject areas would require school communities to decide what kind of evidence would convince them this is a person they would want to send on into the work world or college, or who ought to be able to vote and sit on a jury. What does it look like? What does it look like for a student who leaves 8th grade in our school and who puts together a package of the kind of evidence that they would account for, starting off with a statement then of what it means to be educated, what this school defines as an educated person, and then the kind of evidence that they would count as valid. And then who else should make some judgments about that evidence. And in Boston, the pilot schools in Boston have a a system called School Quality Review, in which every few years someone comes into our school, a group of people come into our school, they spend a week at our school, and they look at the evidence we put together. Both the evidence of what kids had to accomplish in order to graduate 8th grade, what that package looked like, and we have a whole process by which kids had to go through in order to graduate 8th grade, and far more rigorous than the MCAS, and we teach to it. We have an assessment system we start in kindergarten teaching to, but what we're teaching to is a set of, a kind of array of evidence that is very different than a standardized test. And kids produce that evidence in a variety of different ways, just as you and I produce evidence of our competence. I can have two equally competent teachers in school, but the way they display their competence is not the same. And the school then needs, we have this body of, external body, make some judgments about the school. And if they find that the judgments they make are that we're seriously undereducating kids, or that we're missing in some important element, or we're not keeping books properly, we would be on probation for a year while we first respond to them, and if we can't convince them, we have to make some changes. Is that a perfect system? No, it's open to its own set of flaws. But there is no perfect, if we once get in our head there is no perfect system, there's no perfect answer to it, then we have to allow ourselves to explore a variety of different responses to the question of who is an educated person and what kind of evidence does this community count as worthy. And then we need external voices, external eyes, observers who come in and look and say, well, this strikes me as this and this strikes me as that. Even when each one of our 8th graders goes through this arduous graduation process, they have to sit for 6 different graduation committee review committees who look at a compilation of their work together, and they have to orally defend that work. And they do this in front of 5 people, one of whom is learning, is a student, a younger student who's going to learn, who is sitting in this to learn how to do it himself the year after. And there are 2 faculty members, some member of the family, and some external member of the school community who use human judgment. But we build our assessment system around human judgment because our definition of an educated person is someone who has been trained to use judgment, to exercise judgment. If that's our definition of what it means to be educated, then it's also our definition of how we conclude whether someone is educated. But if somebody else thinks their definition of educated person is someone who gets the right answers to a set of questions, I'm going to try to argue with them, but I don't want to outlaw them. That's the peculiar position that I'm in, because I think it will take time to persuade people we're right, and some will probably never be persuaded.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Michael Simons. About 4 or 5 years ago, there was a book written called The Necessity of Experience. Has anybody heard of that? But as
tell us, do you remember the author's name?
Reed. He tragically died too young at about age 40, so he won't be writing any more books. But what was interesting is he talked about primary experience versus secondary experience, and how, when we look at an educated person, is someone who's able to figure things out, someone who knows from their senses, and rather than just receiving education from prepackaged information, a textbook, what have you, actually going out and discovering things, planting a tree rather than just reading about how to plant a tree. As I sit here listening to you, it sounds as so many things are hands-on in the environment that you're promoting. And you also talk about teachers that are doing exciting things. They're interested, they're excited about them, and they're important. They have the experience of doing these exciting things that they can share with the kids, and also the kids perhaps can discover for themselves. Do you see this as being an important thing for the development of an educated person, these types of primary experiences where young people discover things for themselves rather than just being told about them?
Yes, and I'm just trying to remember, I'm trying to remember who it was, some scientists, educator scientists, and I'm trying to remember who the name was, once was arguing that traditionally, kids used schools for the symbolic representational experience because the assumption was that most of their life they had direct experience with the real things. That is, pardon me? Phil Morrison, thank you, yes. And what he was arguing is we're approaching a phenomenon in which schools need to reverse roles. That such a large number of children come into our schools with relatively little direct experience with the world, who have vicariously, who learn the world vicariously and need the school to be someplace where they can actually touch, feel, experience what it is. Water, fire, earth. And of course, when's the last time you saw water? Well, at Mission Hill we still have a water table. But, it begins to seem embarrassing to have water tables and sand tables and pendulums and all those things in our classrooms. Someone says, well, aren't you focused on teaching them to read? And you would almost think, in fact, that the purpose of schools, the purpose of music is to learn to read. You have to justify music because it improves reading skills. And there are a lot of interesting essays written in research projects on how learning music will improve reading or math. And I would argue that the purpose of reading and math is that it makes art. It helps us understand art, maybe, not the other way around. And so I think your point is absolutely right and terrifyingly right in the current climate in which so many children grow up. The number of hours which they spend in front of a monitor or a computer. I was told, really rather persuasively, by someone that I didn't need to have blocks any longer in our classrooms. And think how much room blocks take up. It's hard, especially big blocks, and then enough blocks so you could really build something. Because there is a computer program, maybe some of you have seen it, which do the same thing that blocks do. And I said, what? How can a computer program do the same thing blocks do? Well, this program has blocks. Since blocks, they said, is largely to help children understand shapes, dimensions. It's a pre-mathematical activity, plus the language. There's some language component to it. They learn about square and edges and corners. And there's this program which has these things dropping down, has blocks, and you assemble these blocks on the screen. What's it called? Yeah. Well, I'm not saying it's not it's a game of skill, and it's interesting, and I could spend hours maybe doing it. But it is not the same thing as constructing with blocks. And I mean, even just down to the feeling of the block, and what pleasure it is to buy beautiful blocks. There is a difference between life and books about life. When my brother and I used to argue about traveling, he always insisted on bringing no books with him because he said the way to get to know another country is to live in that country, not to go to another country and spend your time looking in a guidebook about it. Now, maybe there's a balance between that. But you don't have to actually go to the other country at all in the current climate of things. You can bring the other country to your screen. And we are in a frightening period. There's a science fiction story I read as a child that remains with me. And in that science fiction story, the story starts, you have to take the supposition that human beings never see another human beings in this story. They are all related to each other only through virtual reality screens. And for some bizarre reason, this character steps outside and sees another character, and one's a male and one's a female, just to make this more interesting. And they see each other, and they're extraordinarily embarrassed, like they've bumped into someone naked, like they've walked into a bathroom by mistake. And they get intrigued. Anyway, the story goes on from there. But that image of a world in which we no longer touch each other, I think of often in schools today. We're also in schools today in a period in which distrust leads us to be nervous about touching children. So it's almost literally true that we're more and more afraid to touch. This is a pessimistic way to end this conversation. But so I want to tell you something positive, and that is that actually, at this moment in Boston, at this moment in New York City, at this moment in Chicago, a city that I knew well 35 years ago, at this moment in Seattle, and at this moment in Oakland, I have seen more good schools that are not the caricature I've just described than have ever existed in the public sector. That's the eerie moment we're in, and that's why resistance to some of these things is so important. We have, over the last 40, 50 years, built a tradition of good public education slowly, carefully, arduously. It hasn't anywhere near had an opportunity to blossom and reach most children because it's had to face one after another obstacle. It's been sabotaged, unsupported, but it has stuck with it. It has been tenacious. And read Kozel's book about Boston schools in the 1950s and 60s. Read the literature about what Chicago schools. When I started teaching in Chicago and my children started going to schools in Chicago, parents were not allowed inside schools. Teachers were treated enormously worse than they're treated today. It was the primary feeling I had when I came to schools is I can't stick with this profession because I have never been treated with such disrespect in my life. That's not true of all the schools. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of schools in Boston today that reflect the values that I've been describing, and there were virtually none 35, 40 years ago. We got something to hold on to. We have something to defend. We have something to argue for, and we know that with more support, and if we could help build that alliance between families and kids and teachers, we could break through and get the kind of support in which most children could have an opportunity to go to schools this way, and most children would have a chance to play with blocks, to plant and play in water. And not just when they're 5-year-olds, but when they're 15, 25, 35, and even when they're in their 70s. Thank you very much.